The afternoon Letitia Collins finally broke down and wept over that fence. She was not crying about the wood. She was standing in the red dust of the Colorado Territory, her dark hair unraveling from its pins, her hands scraped raw from where she had tried, for the third time that week, to shove the rotted post back into the cracked earth. Splinters had worked themselves deep into her palms. The sun was merciless and enormous above her, the kind of July sun in 1882 that felt like a personal insult. And the fence, what remained of her father's fence, what remained of everything her father had built on the 40 acres outside the town of Caldwell Creek, lay in a jagged, useless heap of broken rails and tilting posts, a line of collapse that stretched nearly 30 feet along the road. And every single rider who had come down that road had passed her by. She had watched them. She had counted them in her darker moments. The cattle hands from the Morrow spread who rode in groups of 3 or 4 every Tuesday morning. The freight wagon driver who always touched the brim of his hat without stopping. The preacher's 2 sons, who were old enough and strong enough and who had looked directly at her from horseback, and then looked away with the deliberate cruelty that only youth can manufacture. The land agent, Mr. Toomey, who had slowed his horse to a near stop, studied the fence, and then studied her with a look that was not about wood at all, and then had ridden on. Not one of them had stopped. Not one of them had offered a hand. And Letitia, who was 26 years old and had been fighting to hold this land together since her father died 14 months ago, since the creditors had started circling, since the neighboring ranchers had begun making quiet, polite, devastating offers to buy her out, Letitia had reached the end of something inside herself that afternoon. Something that had been taut and strong and stubborn had simply frayed through at last, and she had sat down in the red dust next to her broken fence and buried her face in her scraped hands and allowed herself, for the first time since the funeral, to sob. She did not hear the horse slow. She did not hear the boots hit the ground. She only knew someone was there when a shadow fell across her, long and quiet, and a voice said, not with pity, and not with that particular condescension that men reserved for women alone on a property, but with something that sounded remarkably like simple recognition. That is a hard thing to face by yourself. She looked up, furious at being seen in this state, ready to dismiss whoever it was with the same frost she had learned to use as armor. Deputy Jeremiah Wallace was crouching in the dust 3 feet from her, his badge catching the afternoon light, his horse standing patiently behind him with its reins dropped, and he was looking at the fence, not at her. As if he understood instinctively that she needed one more moment before she could bear to be looked at. That small, careful thing undid her entirely. And later, much later, when she would try to explain to her neighbor Mrs. Adeline Porter how it had all begun, she would say it started with a broken fence and a man who bothered to look away at the right moment. But to understand it properly, you had to go back 14 months. You had to go back to the beginning of everything she had been carrying. Letitia Collins had come to Caldwell Creek, Colorado Territory, as a child of 7, riding on the bench seat of a wagon beside her father, Thomas Collins, who had a broad laugh and big dreams and considerably more ambition than capital. Thomas had homesteaded the 40 acres, built the house with his own hands and the help of 2 hired men, planted apple trees along the eastern boundary, and had run a modest but respectable cattle operation through the 1870s. Letitia's mother, Grace, had died of fever when Letitia was 12, and after that it was just the 2 of them, father and daughter, working the land together in a partnership that had its own private language of shared labor and shared grief. She had learned to ride before she could properly read. She had learned to track weather in cloud formations before she had learned to bake bread. She knew how to read a bull's temperament from 40 yards, how to treat a split hoof, how to negotiate at the feed store without getting cheated. Thomas Collins had raised her without apology for what she was, and what she was capable, direct, and completely unprepared for the world's insistence that capability in a woman was somehow suspect. When Thomas died of a heart attack in May of 1881, Without a will that was legally airtight, Letitia had discovered the specific texture of being a woman alone with property in the American West. It was a texture made of legal small print and sideways glances and offers that were dressed in concern, but were fundamentally predatory. The biggest of those offers came from a man named Harlan Morrow, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and who wanted her 40 acres because they sat between his northern range and his southern water access. Harlan was 52 and had been married once, and the way he had looked at Letitia during his first visit to her property, dressed in his good suit and holding his hat in his hands, had made very clear that his interest was not purely in the land. His offer had been financially insulting and personally offensive, and Letitia had shown him the door with a politeness that left absolutely no room for doubt. He had come back twice more with slightly better numbers and a slightly different tone, and each time she had turned him down. After the third visit, his cattle hands had started riding the road along her fence line more frequently, and she had begun to notice small discouragements. A section of her northern fence cut and her cattle scattered, a water pipe blocked, a supply delivery that mysteriously never arrived. Nothing she could prove. Nothing anyone in town would call out directly. This was the world Letitia Collins was navigating on the afternoon her fence fell down. It had actually been undermined slowly. The posts had been drying out for years, the wood going brittle in the way of things left too long without attention, and one night a summer storm had pushed through the county with enough force to tip what was already failing. She had woken to 30 feet of collapsed fence and 3 of her cattle on the road. She had spent 2 days rounding up the cattle and another 3 attempting to repair what was well beyond one person's reasonable capacity to repair alone. She needed new posts, new rails, a post hole digger, someone with the physical strength to drive stakes properly into the rocky Colorado earth, and the time and assistance that she simply did not have in sufficient quantity. And every rider had passed her by, until Jeremiah Wallace. He had not been riding his usual circuit. His usual circuit took him east of town, out toward the disputed grazing lands where tensions between smaller ranchers and larger operations ran hot enough most summers to require a regular visible presence. But that particular Tuesday in July of 1882, he had come west instead because he had received a report of cattle on the road near the Collins property, and had wanted to verify that they had been recovered before some teamster's horses spooked and someone got hurt. He was 31 years old, Jeremiah Wallace, and he had been deputy in Caldwell Creek for 3 years after spending 4 years as a lawman in Kansas. He had come to Caldwell Creek for reasons he kept quietly to himself, reasons connected to a dark past in Dodge City that he had spent considerable effort leaving behind, and he had found in this smaller, less volatile post something that felt, if not quite like peace, then at least like useful purpose. He was known in town as thorough, fair, and notably difficult to rattle. He was also, in the private assessments of most of the women in Caldwell Creek, possessed of a serious, quiet attractiveness, dark eyes, dark hair going slightly silver at the temples despite his relative youth, the kind of weathered solidity that came from years of physical and moral responsibility. He had known about Letitia Collins the way anyone living in a small western town knew about everyone within 20 miles by reputation and by the economic geography of the county. He knew she was Thomas Collins's daughter. He knew Thomas had died. He knew she had been managing the property alone and had turned down Harlan Morrow's offers, which in his private assessment demonstrated either extraordinary courage or extraordinary stubbornness, and which he privately suspected was both. He had not, in 3 years, had any direct dealings with her. Their paths had not crossed in any meaningful way, though he had seen her at the general store twice, and had noticed what most people noticed about Letitia Collins, which was that she moved through space like someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out, with a kind of focused determination that was more interesting than beauty, though she was also undeniably beautiful. So when he came around the bend in the road that Tuesday afternoon and saw the broken fence, he was not entirely surprised. He had seen the gradual deterioration on previous rides past the property. What surprised him was seeing her in the dust, her face in her hands, a figure of such complete and exhausted grief that something in his chest responded before his mind had quite caught up. He had dismounted before he had consciously decided to. He had crouched in the dust and spoken to her before he had formed any particular plan. And when she looked up at him with those dark eyes full of tears and something hotter and fiercer than tears, something like rage actually, a contained furious grief he had felt, with the clarity of a man who had learned to trust his instincts over years of dangerous work, that this was a moment that mattered. "Deputy," she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something. He could see it cost her something. "I am not in need of assistance." He looked at the fence. He looked at her scraped hands. He looked at the sun, still a good 3 hours above the horizon. "I have 3 hours before I need to be back in town," he said, "and that fence is a hazard to the road." Which is, technically, a law enforcement concern. He said this with a very slight, very careful inflection that suggested he was aware it was a pretext. She stared at him. "That is the most elaborate justification for stopping I have ever heard." "I have a post-hole digger in my saddlebag," he said. "I always carry one. It has been useful before." This was a lie. He did not carry a post-hole digger in his saddlebag. He had no idea why he said it. But it made her lips do something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. And so he stood up and walked to his horse and spent a dignified moment investigating his saddlebag, as though expecting the post-hole digger to materialize, and then turned back and said, "I may have confused it with my other saddlebag, but there is a timber yard a half-mile back and I have credit there." She had looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things at once, assessing, guarded, something tentatively like hope working its way through the armor. "I will not accept charity," she said. "It is not charity," he said. "I told you, law enforcement concern." She stood up, brushing dust from her skirt with a practicality that suggested she was not particularly concerned about the dust. "Then, as a law enforcement matter," she said, "you will need to direct the owner of the property in the repair of the fence." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That is exactly what I had in mind." They walked together to the timber yard, his horse walking behind them with its reins loose, the afternoon light turning gold and long across the red dust. And Letitia Collins said very little but listened very carefully as Jeremiah Wallace negotiated with old Pete Stroud at the yard for posts and rails at a fair price. And she noticed that he negotiated without performing authority, without the condescension she had come to expect from men in any position of power in Caldwell Creek. Just calmly and precisely, and with the evident assumption that fair was the expected standard. She paid for the materials herself. He did not try to prevent her. They loaded them onto Pete's small cart, which Pete lent them with the understanding they would return it by morning, and they hauled the materials back to her fence line in the cooling afternoon. He knew what he was doing with a fence. That was the first real surprise. He drove posts with the efficiency of someone who had built things by hand, who understood the physics of force and angle and the particular resistance of rocky soil. He did not explain himself or offer instructions, but when she handed him tools or positioned a rail, they fell into a working rhythm that was surprisingly natural, a back and forth of practical action that felt to Letitia like a conversation, though very few words were spoken. "You have built fence before," she said, around the second post. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri," he said, driving the post with 3 clean strokes of the iron maul. "Before." She waited to see if he would say more. He did not. She catalogued the word before with the same attention she gave to fence posts, something to be understood structurally, what it was holding up, what it was marking as boundary. "Before law work," she said. "Before a lot of things," he said, and moved to the next position. That was the nature of the conversation between them for the next 2 hours, fragments and pauses that were comfortable rather than awkward, punctuated by the physical work of the fence. She learned that he had grown up with two brothers, that his father had been a farmer who had wanted better for his sons than farming, that he had found law work by accident and had stayed in it by choice, and that he took his coffee without sugar, a detail that came up because she went inside at some point and brought out 2 cups from her kitchen stove. He learned that she had been running the property alone for 14 months, that she had 3 milk cows and a small cattle herd, and the apple orchard her father had planted, that she could handle a rifle, and had used one twice in the past year for reasons she did not specify but which he gathered from context were not about hunting, and that she had a specific, articulate fury about the land speculation situation in the county that was entirely accurate, and that he privately agreed with but kept his expression professionally neutral while she described it. "Harlan Morrow," she said, at one point, not as a question. "I am aware of the situation," he said, carefully. "Are you?" she said. It was not quite an accusation. "I am aware," he repeated, "that Mr. Morrow has been making offers on several smaller properties in the county, and I am aware that some of the situations that have come across my desk in the last year have been adjacent to those properties, and I am aware that adjacent is not the same as connected in any way I can formally act upon." He looked at her directly. "I am also aware that the fence line from your northern corner to the road shows cut marks at the base of 3 posts. The silence that followed this was very still. "You saw that," she said. "I am thorough," he said. She looked at him for a long moment and then looked back at the fence, and something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of a recalibration, a first careful adjustment of the assessment she had been making of him. "The first time," she said, "was October. 2 of my cattle were out on the road. I found the cut marks. I did not know if it was deliberate or if the posts were just failing. And the second time, February, different section of fence, same marks." She paused. "I went to the sheriff's office in February." "Dawson was sheriff in February," he said. "Yes." Her tone contained, in that single syllable, a complete summary of why that visit had been unproductive. Jeremiah said nothing, because there was nothing useful he could say about his former superior that would be either professionally appropriate or actually helpful. Sheriff Dawson had retired 3 months ago, and the new sheriff, a man named Cal Briggs who had come up from New Mexico territory, was in Jeremiah's assessment a significant improvement. But none of that helped with what had already been not addressed. "I can ask Briggs to increase our patrol on this road," he said. "I cannot promise what will come of it, but I can ask and I will." She looked at him again with that assessing look. "Why?" He drove another post. "Because it is what should be done." "That is not a complete answer," she said. He stopped working for a moment and looked at her properly, and the afternoon light was doing something to both of them that neither would have been able to articulate: the particular quality of late afternoon sun in Colorado in summer, golden and serious, the way it makes everything look simultaneously ordinary and consequential. "Because you have been managing something that no one person should have to manage alone," he said. "And the fact that you have managed it this long is not a reason to continue doing it entirely alone. That is the complete answer." She handed him the next rail without speaking, but her hands were steady and her eyes were bright. They finished the 30 feet of fence as the sun was going down behind the western ridge, the light going orange and then deep red across the dust, and they stood back and looked at it together, new posts solid and straight, rails cleanly set, the repaired section looking considerably better than the surviving sections on either side. "The rest of it needs attention too," he said. "I am aware of that," she said. "I could come back Saturday," he said. "My day off." The silence stretched. A night bird called somewhere in the direction of the apple orchard. His horse stamped once in the dust. "I would not want to impose on your day off," she said, and her tone was entirely neutral, which both of them understood as a kind of question. "It would not be an imposition," he said, which both of them understood as an answer. She looked at the fence and then at the sky, which was doing extraordinary things in the west, purples and deep oranges layering above the ridge line. "Saturday, then," she said. "I will make supper." He returned Pete Stroud's cart the next morning, and he spent the next 4 days going about his work in a state of internal distraction that he recognized with something between amusement and alarm, as a condition he had not experienced in quite some years. He thought about the way she had looked at the fence when they finished it, not with relief, but with a kind of fierce proprietorial satisfaction, as if the fence were a declaration. He thought about the articulate precision of her anger, which was not unfocused or self-pitying, but measured and directed. The anger of someone who had thought carefully about what was actually unjust about her situation and had refused to make peace with it. He thought about her hands, the scraped palms and the competent way she had handled the tools, and he thought about the single moment when their fingers had brushed in the exchange of the level, and he had felt something travel up his arm with the specificity of a message. He also thought about the reasons he had come to Caldwell Creek from Dodge City, and the reasons he had never quite allowed himself to want anything that required staying, and he thought about whether Letitia Collins was the kind of person who made staying feel like something other than surrender. He had a dark past. That was not melodrama. It was the plain, factual structure of it. In Dodge City in 1877, when he had been 26 and newly deputized and full of the uncomplicated conviction that law was law and justice followed from it like water from a spring, he had been part of an operation that had gone wrong in ways that still woke him at 2 in the morning sometimes, cold and certain that he should have done something different, should have stopped something, should have understood what was actually happening before it was too late. A man had died. A man named Rufus Holt, who had been a small rancher on the edge of Dodge City's orbit, had been caught between two powerful interests that were using the law as a tool, and Jeremiah had been young enough and trusting enough of his superiors to do what he was told until the moment he understood that what he was being told to do was wrong, and by then it was too late for Rufus Holt. He had quit the Dodge City office the next morning. He had spent a year working as a civilian, a ranch hand, trying to decide if the law could be something other than what he had seen it be. He had come to the conclusion, slowly and with considerable evidence on both sides, that the law was what the person holding it made of it, and that he would rather be a person holding it and trying to make it just than stand back from it entirely and let it be something else. So he had come to Caldwell Creek and taken the deputy position, and had spent 3 years trying to be the kind of lawman that Rufus Holt would have deserved. And now, sitting in his small room above the hardware store and thinking about Letitia Collins and the cut marks at the base of her fence posts, he felt the familiar cold weight of that old obligation pressing against something new and warm, and he recognized that these two things were going to require him to be careful and honest and quite brave. Saturday came with a blue sky and a brisk morning that softened by noon into a perfect summer warmth, and Jeremiah arrived at the Collins property at 9 in the morning with his tools and his horse, and a paper sack from the general store that contained, among other things, additional nails and a bottle of linseed oil for treating the remaining posts. She was already working when he arrived, having gotten up at dawn to complete her morning chores so that the day would be available. She had also, though she would not have characterized it this way to anyone, changed her dress twice before settling on a practical blue calico that she told herself was simply appropriate for fence work. They worked through the morning with an increasing ease that both of them felt and neither directly acknowledged, the way you feel a change in weather without yet naming it. She told him about the apple orchard, her father's particular pride, the way Thomas Collins had hand-carried saplings all the way from Kansas, because he had read somewhere that Colorado's altitude would produce exceptional fruit if the strain was right and you were patient enough. Jeremiah told her about a farm in Missouri where his mother had kept a kitchen garden of extraordinary ambition, tomatoes and sweet corn and mint, that had escaped and colonized half an acre on its own. They were both, they discovered, people who had been shaped by land, by the specific education of watching things grow and understanding what growth required. She showed him the apple trees after lunch, a tour that was ostensibly about assessing whether the orchard fence needed work, and the trees were heavy with green apples just beginning to blush at their shoulders, the whole orchard smelling of growing things and warm bark, and she watched him touch the bark of one of the older trees with a kind of gentle attention that made her chest do something inconvenient. "They are doing well," he said. "They are," she said. "My father talked to them. I always thought it was, well, not rational. But I have started doing it too." He looked at her with the faintest trace of a smile, and it changed his face considerably. He was a serious man, and the smile was a serious thing too, not bright or easy but genuine, something that arrived with deliberation. "What do you say to them?" she considered. "Practical things mostly. What needs doing, what the weather is, what I am worried about." She paused. "It turns out that saying worries out loud to an apple tree is more useful than I expected. They do not offer opinions. Unlike most people in this county," he said. "Unlike most people in this county," she agreed, and they were standing close enough in the shade of the orchard that she could see the silver at his temples very clearly, and the afternoon had gone very quiet around them, just the sound of a breeze in the apple leaves and his horse cropping grass somewhere nearby. "I want to talk to you about Harlan Morrow," he said, and the warmth of the moment shifted slightly but did not disappear. He had said it seriously, the way he would introduce something difficult that needed to be said regardless of its difficulty. "All right," she said. He walked a few steps and she walked with him, and they came out of the orchard shade into the afternoon sun, and he said, "I spoke to Sheriff Briggs this week. I told him what I found at the fence posts. He is willing to open a preliminary inquiry, but he needs something to work with beyond what I can personally observe. He needs either additional incidents, documented, or a witness, or some form of direct evidence." "So nothing," she said, but without bitterness, just with the recognition of someone who understood the mechanisms of evidence. "Not nothing," he said. "It means you document everything from this point forward, every incident, every encounter, every suspicious thing you observe. You keep records, dates, times, descriptions, and you continue to refuse Morrow's offers because if this is what I believe it is, the pressure will escalate when his patience runs out, and when it escalates, it will produce exactly the evidence that Briggs needs." She was quiet for a moment. "You are telling me to wait for it to get worse." "I am telling you that the getting worse is already coming," he said, "whether you document it or not. The documentation is what transforms it from something that just happens to you into something that can be acted upon." She looked out at the road, at the repaired fence, at the land her father had built and that she had been defending with diminishing resources for over a year. "That is a hard thing to hear." "I know it," he said. "I am sorry for it." She turned to look at him, and there was something in his expression, a deep, specific gravity, the weight of someone who understood about injustice and about the particular exhaustion of being the person who has to stand and endure until the mechanism of justice can catch up, that told her this was not abstract for him, that he had been somewhere near this before on one side or the other. "You know what it is like," she said, "to watch something unfair happen and not be able to stop it directly." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, simply and completely. She did not ask more. He did not offer more. But something passed between them in the afternoon light of the apple orchard that was as real as the fence posts, as the repaired rails, as the smell of linseed oil and new wood. Something that was about trust, specifically, and about the rarity of finding another person who understood that justice was not always immediate, that sometimes the best you could do was stand in the gap and document and wait and not give up. They went back to work on the fence, and they worked until the light was going, and then she made supper as promised, a proper meal of salt pork and beans and cornbread and canned tomatoes from her cellar, served on the kitchen table with the oil lamp lit between them, and they ate with the comfortable ease of people who had spent a physical day together and had earned the meal. He helped her clear the table, which she did not expect, and then stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and said, "Thank you for supper. It was excellent." "Thank you for the fence," she said. "Both sections." They were standing at the door, the warm night outside full of insect sound and the distant moan of a coyote, and she was very aware that he was going to leave now and that she was going to go into the house alone, which was what she did every night, which had never bothered her as much as it bothered her at this particular moment. "I will see you at the sheriff's office on Monday," he said, "to begin the documentation process formally." "Monday," she said. He put his hat on and went to his horse and rode away into the dark, and she stood in her doorway and watched until the sound of hoofbeats faded, and then she went inside and stood in her kitchen for a while, doing nothing in particular, which was unlike her. Mrs. Adeline Porter, who was 54 and had been married for 28 years to the county surveyor, and who was Letitia's nearest neighbor and closest confidant, received the full account of the fence, and the 2 Saturdays the following week over tea. She listened with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had made an extensive study of human nature, and when Letitia finished, Adeline said, "He came back the 2nd Saturday. To finish the remaining fence," Letitia said. "Of course," said Adeline, "and he came inside for supper. I made supper, it seemed appropriate after a day of work. Naturally, and he helped clear the table." "He did." "Letitia," said Adeline with great patience, "I have lived in this county for 22 years. I have met every man worth knowing in it. Jeremiah Wallace has never, in the 3 years he has been here, helped anyone clear a table, or come back a 2nd Saturday. Or," she stirred her tea thoughtfully, carried linseed oil as a surprise. Letitia looked at her cup. "I am not in a position to be what?" A pause. "Distracted." "Distracted," Adeline repeated. She put down her spoon. "You are 26 years old, and you have been alone on that property for 14 months, and you have been fighting Harlan Morrow's machinery by yourself for most of that time. And a good, solid, serious man spent 2 of his free days fixing your fence and eating at your table, and is now helping you build a legal case. And the word you have arrived at for this situation is distracted." Letitia said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "I cannot afford to want things that might not work out," Adeline said gently. "Yes, my dear girl." Adeline reached across the table and covered Letitia's hand with hers. "The whole of life is wanting things that might not work out. That is not a reason to stop wanting them. That is the whole project." Monday's visit to the sheriff's office was professional and practical, and Jeremiah was the deputy and she was the landowner, and there was a certain discipline required in navigating that clarity of role when the air between them had become the kind of charged thing it had become. Sheriff Briggs, a lean, thoughtful man of 40 who wore his experience without swagger, was direct and straightforward about what the process required and what it could and could not promise. Letitia left with a formal incident report filed, a blank journal that Briggs had pulled from his desk drawer and given her for documentation purposes, and the understanding that the law was now officially paying attention, which was something. Jeremiah walked her out to the street and stood with her in the morning dust of Caldwell Creek's main thoroughfare, and in the daylight with the town around them and other people visible at various distances. There was a strange, specific intimacy in standing close enough to speak quietly and far enough apart for propriety. "How are you feeling about it?" he asked. "Steadier," she said honestly. "It helps to have it on record." "It does," he said. He paused. "I should tell you something about why this is not entirely abstract for me." She looked at him carefully. He glanced down the street, a man checking his surroundings by instinct, and then looked back at her. "I was in Dodge City before I came here. I was involved in a situation where a man lost his property, his life, eventually, because powerful people used the law as a tool, and I was too inexperienced to understand what was happening until it was too late to stop it." His voice was even and controlled, but something underneath it was not. "I have been living with that for 5 years. I want you to know that when I tell you that we will build this case and we will not let Morrow do to you what was done to Rufus Holt, I am telling you that with everything I have. Not as a procedural matter. He paused, choosing carefully, as a personal commitment. She was very still. Rufus Holt, she said softly. He was a small rancher, good man. He was ground down between two land interests and a corrupt operation, and by the time I understood what I was participating in, he was dead and his family was gone from the county. He met her eyes. I will not watch that happen again. There was so much in what he had said, so much weight of it, that she understood it would take time to fully receive. But the immediate and important thing was that she said, quietly and directly, "I believe you." And she did. Without reservation or qualification, she believed him. The weeks that followed were a complicated weave of the professional and the personal, the formal and the intimate, the practical business of building a case and the gradual, almost involuntary business of falling in love. They met on official grounds every week, at the sheriff's office, where she would report any new incidents, and he would update her on the progress of the inquiry. She had begun her documentation immediately and thoroughly, keeping the journal with the precision of someone who understood that records were weapons. There were 2 more incidents in August, her water pipe blocked again, and a section of her north fence with fresh cuts, and she documented both meticulously, and both went into the official file. Harlan Morrow made a 4th offer in August, this time through a lawyer from Denver whom he had apparently hired specifically for this negotiation. The offer was the best yet financially, and the lawyer presented it in a large document full of impressive language, and Letitia read every word of it, and then folded it back into the envelope and handed it to the lawyer and said, "No, thank you," and closed the door. She told Jeremiah about this the following Tuesday in the sheriff's office, and she watched his expression do something careful and complicated before it settled into professional neutrality, and she thought that professional neutrality was costing him something too. "He is escalating the pressure," Jeremiah said. "I understand that," she said. "Are you all right?" The question was professional in framing but personal in inflection, and she answered it personally. "I am better than I was 2 months ago," she said. "I am considerably less alone with it." His eyes held hers for a moment. "Good," he said. The word was simple and contained in its simplicity something that was neither of them were quite saying yet. It was Adeline Porter who eventually forced the issue, not through interference but through the accidental mechanism of her annual late summer supper, which she gave every August, and to which she invited everyone she liked in the county, which this year included Letitia Collins, and for the first time, Deputy Jeremiah Wallace. They had not previously been in a purely social situation together. All their meetings had had a functional frame, the fence, the documentation, the legal process. Adeline's supper party, held outdoors on her large porch with lanterns hung in the trees and a table set for 14, removed that frame entirely. Jeremiah arrived and found Letitia already there, and they greeted each other with the slightly formal courtesy of people managing the distance between professional habit and what had actually been happening. And then Adeline Porter put them next to each other at the table with the serene certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Supper was long and easy, the way summer evenings can be, full of the county's social conversation, horses and land and weather and the new school teacher and the disputed road expansion. And Jeremiah and Letitia talked in the way they always talked, seriously, specifically, with the attention they gave to each other in their weekly meetings carried easily into this different context. They were simply themselves. There was nothing to perform and nothing to prove. He told a story about his first week as a lawman in Kansas that was genuinely funny, and she laughed with her whole face, and several people at the table looked at both of them with expressions of mild, pleased recognition. After supper, when the gathering had moved into the easy dispersal of a party ending, they walked together in Adeline's garden, which was well lit enough by lanterns and moon to be entirely proper, and the ease of the evening and the removal of the professional frame had done something between them that could not quite be undone. "I did not know you could tell a story like that," she said. "I generally don't," he said. "It requires a specific context." "And what is the specific context?" He looked at her sideways, and the moon was up and bright, and the lanterns were warm in the trees around them. "Good company," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it without pretense or deflection, made her stop walking for a moment. She had been telling herself carefully, consistently, with the same discipline she applied to documentation and fence repair and every other practical necessity of her life, that she was not in a position to fall in love. She had a property to defend, and a case to build, and a man like Harlan Morrow pressing on every side, and emotional distraction was a luxury she could not afford. Walking in Adeline Porter's moonlit garden, she understood with sudden clarity that she had been lying to herself, and that she had been lying to herself for approximately 6 weeks, and that the particular honesty that Jeremiah Wallace seemed to carry as a matter of nature made it extremely difficult to maintain dishonesty in his proximity. "Jeremiah," she said, and his name in her mouth, his first name, which she had not used before, stopped him too. They were standing between 2 lanterns, and the light was doing that thing again, the thing it had done in the apple orchard, the thing that made everything look simultaneously ordinary and consequential. "There is something I want to say," she said. "If I may." "Please," he said. "I have been—" She paused, finding the right words with the care she found them for the documentation journal exact and honest. "I have been aware for some time that the way we work together and talk together is not something I have experienced with another person before. Not in this way. And I am aware that the situation, my situation, the legal matter makes certain things complicated." She met his eyes. "But I think it would be dishonest to continue pretending that what I feel is simply professional regard." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. He was a man who received important information with stillness. She knew that about him now, the same stillness he had used when he crouched in the dust on the day of the fence, and looked away to give her the space to recover herself. "It would be equally dishonest on my part," he said, "to pretend that the reason I have been thorough in your case beyond what my duties strictly require is entirely about justice in the abstract." She felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for a very long time. "There is the complication," she said, "your professional involvement." "It is a complication," he said, "not an impossibility." He was quiet for a moment. "My personal feelings do not change the quality of the work I am doing for you. If anything," he paused, and something moved in his expression that was carefully contained, "they make me more committed to it, not less. Because I want you to be free and clear and secure on that land, not because I am professionally obligated to pursue it, but because you deserve to be free and clear and secure on that land. And after," she said, "if the case resolves, if Morrow is dealt with." "After," he said, "I would very much like to court you if you would allow it, formally and properly and with your full knowledge and consent as to what I am about." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight and the warmth of that, the old-fashioned dignity of it, the way he said it without presumption. "I would allow it," she said. They walked back to the party, and if Adeline Porter observed from her porch the way they stood slightly closer together than before, and the way they looked at each other once with something perfectly clear and perfectly unspoken, she said nothing about it to anyone except her husband, to whom she said, very quietly, "I told you so," and he agreed that she had. September brought a clarity to the Colorado air that turned the mornings sharp and the afternoons long and golden, and it also brought the escalation that Jeremiah had predicted and that Letitia had been documenting and waiting for. Harlan Morrow, apparently concluding that the legal approach through his Denver lawyer had run its course, shifted his strategy. 2 of his hands were seen on her property, east of the north fence line, on a Tuesday morning, clearly not there by accident and clearly not there to do anything constructive. When she confronted them, and she did confront them, riding out herself with her rifle across her saddle because she was not a woman who sent for help first and acted second. They were insolent enough to make clear that this was deliberate and that the deliberateness was a message. She documented the encounter in precise detail. The time, the location, the names of the two men she recognized as Morrow's hands, what they said, what they did, the specific nature of the insolence. She rode into town that afternoon and gave the report to Jeremiah, and she watched him read it with an expression that was a controlled thing trying to contain something that was not controlled at all. "This is trespass," he said. "Documented trespass. This is what Briggs needs." "Then let us use it," she said. The process moved swiftly after that, with the particular velocity that legal mechanisms achieve once they have what they need. Sheriff Briggs issued a formal warning to Morrow's operation, backed by the documented record of the fence incidents and the trespass, and made clear that any further incidents would result in formal charges. The Denver lawyer wrote a careful letter in response that was entirely about legal positioning, and Briggs wrote a careful response in return that was entirely about the sufficiency of the evidence. Morrow came to see Letitia himself. This was what she had not anticipated. She had expected his response to come through lawyers and intermediaries, and instead he came himself on a Tuesday morning in late September, riding up to her property in his good suit on his good horse, looking like what he was. A powerful man accustomed to getting what he wanted who was being told, for possibly the first time in his professional life, that he could not have it. He was civil. She had expected him to be civil. Men like Harlan Morrow were always civil because civility was another form of power, the demonstration that you could afford to be pleasant because the outcome was not in doubt. He told her she was being unreasonable. He told her she was a woman alone managing something too large for one person to manage. He told her she was fighting against the natural direction of things, that smaller operations gave way to larger ones because it was economically inevitable. And he said all of this as if he were describing weather rather than orchestrating pressure. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and then she said, "Mr. Morrow, you have cut my fence twice, blocked my water, put your men on my property, and sent a lawyer with documents intended to obscure what is a straightforward refusal on my part. All of that is documented and is sitting in Sheriff Briggs's files. I am not going to sell this property. Not to you, not to anyone. It is not for sale. That is the final word on the subject, and any further efforts to change it will go directly into those files and will have direct legal consequences. Good morning." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man revising his assessment of an obstacle, and then he said, "You are Thomas Collins's daughter right through," which might have been an insult or might have been the only honest thing he had said in the conversation, and then he rode away. She went inside and stood in her kitchen for a moment, shaking, which she had not done in front of him, and then she made tea and sat down and waited for the shaking to stop, which it did, because she had learned that things that shook her eventually stopped, and she was still standing after they did. She told Jeremiah that afternoon. He was quiet when she finished, and then he said, "You handled that perfectly." "I handled it the way I had to," she said. "The way you had to is the way a person with extraordinary composure handles a situation designed to break that composure," he said. "That is not nothing, Letitia. That is a great deal." She looked at him. He was standing across her kitchen table from her, where he had come to check on her after hearing from Briggs that Morrow had ridden out to the Collins property, and the afternoon sun was coming through the window, and he looked like what she had come to understand he was, which was a man of genuine, complicated, carefully deployed goodness who had arrived in her life through the mechanism of a broken fence. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "When this is over," she said, "and you said you wanted to court me properly, what does that mean to you? What are you thinking about when you think about after?" He was quiet for a moment. It was not the quiet of evasion but of honesty being assembled properly. "I am thinking about staying," he said. "I have spent 5 years in Caldwell Creek half staying, doing the work well but not quite putting down anything that would require permanence. I did not entirely understand why until recently. He met her eyes. I think about this land and the apple trees and the way you talk about your father and the way you talk to those trees yourself. I think about being the person who is on this property with you, not as a visitor, not passing through. I think about building something. He paused. I realize that is more than you asked. It is exactly what I asked, she said quietly. October came, and the legal situation resolved with the quiet definitiveness of well-constructed evidence. Morrow's lawyer negotiated a settlement of the trespass matter that included a formal agreement to discontinue all contact with and pressure on the Collins property, legally binding and witnessed by Briggs and the county judge. It was not a dramatic public victory, but it was a real one, the specific mechanism of accountability, properly applied, producing the outcome it was supposed to produce. The day the agreement was signed, Letitia rode home in the clear October light and stood in front of her fence, the whole fence, repaired and treated and solid, running the full perimeter of the property, and felt something she had not felt in 14 months. She felt like the land was hers again. Not embattled, not temporary, not conditional. Hers. She went inside and opened the kitchen door and spoke to the apple trees from the doorway, which she did not usually do with witnesses present. But she was alone, and she told them what had happened, and the October wind moved through the orchard in a way that she chose, sensibly, to interpret as response. That evening, Jeremiah came to her property, not officially, not with papers or documentation, just with himself and his horse, and 2 bottles of cider from the store in town that he had evidently determined was the appropriate thing to bring for an occasion of this kind. She set glasses on the porch and they sat in the October evening, which was cool and clear, the first stars coming up over the ridge, and they drank cider and were quiet for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was a full and comfortable thing rather than an empty one. "I have something to say," he said eventually. "I am listening," she said. He turned to face her in the porch chair, and in the last light he was entirely serious and entirely without pretense, which was what he was. "The case is resolved. I told you after, I am telling you after. I would like to formally court you, Letitia Collins. I would like to do this with every intention of permanence if you will have me." She set down her glass. "I have a condition," she said. "Name it," he said. "This land is mine," she said. "If we marry, I am saying if, at this juncture, though I want you to understand that the if is not particularly doubtful on my part, this land remains mine. Not ours in the way that the law currently makes a woman's property her husband's automatically, mine specifically. I have already spoken to a lawyer in Denver about how to structure such an arrangement," he said. "It is possible with the right documents. If you want it, I will see that it is done." She looked at him for a long moment. "You spoke to a lawyer in Denver," she said. "I wanted to know what was possible before I asked," he said. "So that the asking was not conditional on you trusting that I would eventually do right. I wanted to know that I could offer the specific thing rather than the general intention. That he had done this, that he had quietly, practically investigated how to give her what mattered most to her before he had said a word about his own desires, undid the last of any remaining reserve she might have maintained. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes, the if is not doubtful on my part either." He reached across the small distance between the chairs and took her hand, and held it with the careful, deliberate warmth of a man who understood the weight of what he was holding. And they sat on her porch in the October dark with the stars coming out and the apple orchard breathing quietly in the evening wind. And neither of them said anything else for a long while, because there was nothing else that needed to be said. The courtship that followed was conducted with the kind of serious attention that both of them gave to everything they undertook. It was not a courtship of grand gestures. It was one of consistent presence, of building the specific habits of a shared life, tentatively and then with increasing confidence. He came for supper on Thursdays. She came to the sheriff's office on Tuesdays, now for no official reason beyond that the office had become a place she was welcome in. They rode the property together on Saturday mornings, assessing what needed maintenance, discussing the cattle and the orchard and the water access, the practical vocabulary of the land becoming a shared language. He met Adeline Porter properly at a November gathering, and Adeline, whose opinion Letitia valued above almost all others, made her assessment clear afterward with characteristic economy. "He listens when you talk," she said to Letitia. "Not waiting for his turn. He actually listens. Those are genuinely rare, you know." The winter was mild for Colorado, which was to say it was occasionally brutal, but the brutal spells were interspersed with clear, cold days that were beautiful in the specific way that winter beauty requires, sharp-edged and crystalline, the sky an impossible blue above the snow-dusted ridges. On one of those clear December days, Jeremiah came with a book of poetry that had been his mother's, which he lent to Letitia because she had mentioned in passing that she had been a reader as a girl and had fewer books than she would like. She read the whole book in a week and returned it with 3 pages of notes about specific poems, which made him laugh, that real, specific, carefully deployed laugh, and which he kept. They were standing in her kitchen doorway when she handed back the book, and the December sun was coming through the window at a low angle, the way winter sun comes, and she was saying something about a particular poem when he kissed her, very gently and briefly, and then stood back to see how she received it. She received it by putting her hand on his jaw and kissing him back with considerably more intention, which settled the question of how she received it. He proposed formally in January, in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, with a ring that had been his mother's, a small, plain band with a single dark stone that Letitia would later describe to Adeline as exactly the kind of ring she would have chosen for herself, which was not an accident because he had said as much before he asked. "This was my mother's, and it is plain and honest and not trying to be anything other than what it is, and I think that is what you would want, but if I am wrong, tell me and we will find something else." She had looked at the ring and then at him and then back at the ring and said, "You are not wrong." She said yes before he had quite finished the question, which he would remember afterward with a warmth that lived permanently in his chest. They married in April of 1883, on a Saturday, in the small church in Caldwell Creek on a day of extraordinary spring sunshine, with Adeline Porter weeping happily in the front pew and Sheriff Briggs standing as Jeremiah's witness, and every person in the county who liked either of them filling the pews behind, which was considerably more people than either of them had anticipated. The ceremony was brief and direct and entirely sincere, and when they walked out into the April sunshine together, her hand in his, Letitia Collins, now Letitia Collins Wallace, though she kept both names, which was part of what the Denver lawyer had arranged, she felt that the world was the correct size and the correct temperature, and that she was standing in exactly the right place. The reception was held at the Collins property, on the long porch and spreading onto the grass of the front yard, and people ate and talked, and the evening went long and warm and full of fiddle music from the Morrison brothers who played at every county event. And at some point late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and a few remained in the gentle end-of-celebration way, Jeremiah found Letitia standing at the edge of the apple orchard in her wedding dress with her shoes off, her bare feet in the new April grass, talking to the trees, he said, coming to stand beside her. "I was telling them," she said. "What happened today? What did they say?" She looked at him sideways, her face full of everything, the day and the warmth of it and the deep satisfaction of having arrived somewhere real. "They were glad," she said. "I think they were glad." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and the apple orchard breathed around them in the spring night, and the fiddle music came faintly from the porch, and the stars were enormous and multiple above the ridge. They moved through the rest of spring and into summer building the specific architecture of a shared life, which was both easier and more interesting than either of them had expected, because they were well matched in the ways that mattered and different in ways that were complementary rather than conflicting. He brought a steadiness to the property that she had been compensating for alone for too long, an extra set of hands, an extra mind, an extra presence that made the daily management of the 40 acres something closer to manageable. She brought to his life a groundedness in place and purpose that he had not known he was missing, but recognized immediately when he felt it, the specific weight of belonging somewhere. He kept his position as deputy, which Letitia supported entirely. It mattered to him, and it was work done in good faith and with genuine integrity, and she had seen enough of it to know that his presence in that office was not incidental to the general welfare of the county. She accompanied him occasionally when he rode his circuit on days she could be away from the property, and they had a particular ease on horseback together that was one of their specific pleasures. Two people who had learned horses early and who understood the communication of riding side by side. In the autumn of 1883, she told him over breakfast, with a directness that was characteristic, that she was pregnant. He set down his coffee cup. She watched his face do several things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation of the calendar, and then something warm and large, and not at all controlled, coming up through all the professional discipline and the careful management of expression that was his habitual manner, something that looked like pure, unguarded joy. "In April," she said, working it out. "In April," he repeated, and then stood up and came around the table and held her with the particular care of someone holding something precious, which she both accepted and found slightly funny, given that she was not fragile and he knew she was not fragile. "I am not made of glass," she said, into his shoulder. "I know that," he said, not loosening his hold. "You are going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Probably," he agreed. The pregnancy was straightforward and managed with the practical attention that Letitia brought to everything. And in April of 1884 she delivered a boy, in the bedroom of the house her father had built, with the assistance of Mrs. Porter and the county doctor, a competent and amiable man named Dr. Hargrove, who had brought half the county's current generation into the world. They named him Thomas, for Letitia's father, and he arrived into the world with a set of opinions about it that he expressed immediately and thoroughly. Jeremiah held his son for the first time while Letitia slept in the bedroom, and Mrs. Porter tidied up with a satisfied efficiency, and he stood in the kitchen with the baby in his arms and looked out the window at the apple orchard, which was in full spring bloom, the trees white and faintly pink against the blue sky. And he understood with the full force of it what had happened in his life in the 2 years, since a Tuesday afternoon in July when he had come around a bend in a road and seen a woman sitting in the dust next to a broken fence, and something in him had known, before any reasonable basis for knowing, that this mattered. He had come to this county with a dark past and the intention of usefulness and no expectation of happiness, beyond the satisfaction of work well done. He had arrived at something that was so far beyond the plan that the plan seemed almost comically insufficient in retrospect. He went back to the bedroom quietly and sat in the chair beside the bed where Letitia was sleeping with the deep, earned sleep of someone who had just accomplished something extraordinary, and he held the baby and watched her sleep, and the afternoon light came through the window warm and gold, the same April light that had been in the orchard when she had shown him the trees for the first time and told him she talked to them, and he thought that the apple trees probably had opinions about today too. Thomas Collins Wallace grew into a child of considerable character and an early interest in horses, both of which his parents handled with the same thoughtful attention they had given to everything. The property thrived in a way that felt like vindication. The orchard produced its exceptional fruit, the cattle operation expanded modestly but steadily, and the 40 acres that Letitia had defended so fiercely had become, without anyone making a formal announcement of it, one of the most well-run small operations in the county. Jeremiah was made sheriff in 1885 when Cal Briggs retired to New Mexico, a promotion that came with a modest increase in salary and a considerable increase in responsibility, both of which he took seriously. He hired a deputy, a young man of 23 named James Kerr, who reminded him somewhat of himself at that age, serious, earnest, not yet knowing enough to know how much he didn't know. And he mentored him with the specific patience of someone who understood what it was to be learning something difficult and consequential. Letitia, for her part, had quietly become a figure of some weight in the county's informal economy, not because she sought it, but because her management of the orchard and the understanding of agricultural conditions that she had developed over years had made her someone other small landowners came to for practical advice. She gave it freely and without condescension, and the network of smaller ranchers and farmers in the county was meaningfully better off for having someone who had fought Harlan Morrow and won, and who was willing to tell you exactly how she had done it. Harlan Morrow himself had largely withdrawn from active land acquisition in the county after the legal confrontation, not because he had reformed, but because the evidence that Briggs held made further aggression impolitic. He remained in the county and remained powerful and remained, in Letitia's private assessment, a man who had chosen the wrong values and had enough intelligence to understand when the game had turned against him. She was not conciliatory toward him, but she was no longer afraid of him, and the difference between those two states was everything. There was an evening in the summer of 1886 when Letitia and Jeremiah sat on the porch after Thomas was in bed, the way they had developed the habit of sitting after the day was done, and the summer evening was everything Colorado summer evenings could be, warm and deep and full of the sound of the land settling into night, and she said, apropos of nothing specific, "I have been thinking about the fence." He looked at her sideways. "The fence? When you stopped," she said. "I was in the most desperate state I had been in since my father died. I had been trying for 3 days to fix something that was beyond me alone, and I had not slept properly, and I had watched every person I knew ride past me without stopping, and I was sitting in the dust feeling utterly abandoned, and you stopped." She paused. "I was so angry at you initially." He looked surprised. "Angry at me?" "I was angry at everything," she said. "The fence and the dust and the sun and every single person who had passed me by. And you stopped, and I was furious at you for stopping because being furious at the person who stopped was easier than feeling relieved," he said softly. "Grateful," she said. "Hopeful. Those are terrifying things to feel when you have been alone and fighting for a long time, because hope means there is something to lose." She looked at him, this man who was hers and whose steadiness had become the structure she leaned on without losing her own. "I am so glad you stopped." He reached across and took her hand, the same way he had on her porch in October 3 years before, with the same careful, deliberate warmth. "I have thought about that afternoon too," he said. "I came around that bend and I saw you and I dismounted before I knew what I was doing. I have tried to understand what it was, specifically, if it was professional instinct or was it?" she said. "No," he said. "It was not." "What was it then?" He was quiet for a moment, the same thinking stillness she had learned and loved. "It was recognition," he said. "I looked at you in that dust and I recognized something. I could not have told you what at the time, but looking back," he paused, and the word that he arrived at was precise and honest and entirely his. "I recognized someone who deserved to be seen, and I thought, if no one else is going to stop, then I will stop." She leaned against his shoulder, and the night was around them, and the land was quiet and solid under the stars. And she could hear, faintly, Thomas making some small sound in the house that resolved into the breathing of a sleeping child, and the apple orchard was dark and present at the edge of the yard, and everything she had fought for and held onto and refused to surrender was intact, and hers and inhabited, finally, by the life she had needed it to be for. "I am glad you were riding this road that day," she said. "So am I," he said. The apple trees produced abundantly that year, and the year after, and the year after that. In 1887, Letitia delivered their second child, another boy they named Samuel, who arrived with even louder opinions than Thomas had, and who had, very obviously from the start, his father's dark eyes and his mother's fierce, uncompromising attention. Thomas, by then 3 years old, received his brother with the diplomatic equanimity of someone who had not particularly been asked his opinion, and had concluded that the new development was acceptable. Jeremiah held Samuel in the kitchen while Letitia rested, the same way he had held Thomas 3 years before, standing at the window looking at the apple orchard. And the orchard was in summer leaf this time, green and heavy and full of the season. And he told his new son, because Letitia had taught him this, what had happened today and what the land was, and what the family was, and what had been built on this 40 acres of Colorado earth that had once been a broken fence, and a woman in the dust, and a deputy who stopped when everyone else had ridden by. Some years later, when Thomas was old enough to ask the story, as children ask for family stories, repeatedly and with the satisfaction of the familiar, he asked his mother how she and his father had met. And Letitia, who had never been given to the kind of softening embellishment that turns true stories into comfortable ones, told him the truth, which was this, that every rider had passed her broken fence until the deputy stopped and spent his afternoon fixing it, and that she had been furious at first and grateful second and in love by October, and that nothing in her life had ever been more reliably the right thing. Thomas thought about this. He was 7 and serious in the way of children who have had serious adults for company. Did he know? Thomas asked. When he stopped, did he know what would happen? She thought about what Jeremiah had said on the porch that summer evening, that it was recognition, that he had looked at her and recognized someone who deserved to be seen. He knew something, she said. He did not know everything, but he knew something that was important. Thomas considered this with the gravity it deserved. That is a good reason to stop, he said. It is the best reason, she said. The 40 acres kept producing, year after year, the apple trees growing taller and the cattle operation finding its steady rhythm, and the house that Thomas Collins had built with his own hands, and that his daughter had defended with hers, and that Jeremiah Wallace had come to in the second half of his life without quite knowing he was coming home. That house held them all, season after season, in the specific good fortune of people who know what they have and what it cost, and who tended accordingly. The fence, the whole fence, ran solid and maintained along every boundary, treated every spring and checked every fall, repaired when it needed repairing, the posts straight and the rails tight and the whole line of it standing as a kind of quiet declaration. This land is held. This land is kept. The people here are not going anywhere. And every spring, when the apple trees bloomed white against the Colorado sky, Letitia Collins Wallace stood in the orchard and told the trees what had happened since last bloom. The children's latest milestones, the property's condition, what she was grateful for, what she was working on, and more often than not, Jeremiah came and stood beside her, not talking to the trees himself but listening to her do it, and it was a conversation between them two, in its way. The same way all the best conversations are, not statements requiring response, but presents offered and presents received, the two of them standing in the apple light with everything they had built around them and everything they still intended to build still ahead. The dark past that had followed Jeremiah to Caldwell Creek did not disappear. He carried Rufus Holt with him always, the specific weight of that old failure, a thing he had made peace with but never forgotten. But it had been transformed into something useful, into the quality of his attention to his work, and the ferocity of his commitment to doing it honestly. And in Letitia's 40 acres he had found the specific context that made a life. Not the absence of darkness, but the presence of light enough to see by. And Letitia, who had sat in the dust of a July afternoon in 1882 with scraped palms and exhausted grief, watching rider after rider pass her broken fence without stopping, had found in the man who did stop not just assistance with the fence, though the fence was real and the afternoon was real, and the linseed oil and the new posts were real, but something that had remade the entire context of her life, had changed the meaning of all of it, had turned a besieged and lonely holding of ground into an inhabited and shared and growing thing. The fence stood. The orchard grew. The children were raised in the full knowledge of what the land required and what it gave back. The sheriff and his wife were known in Caldwell Creek and beyond as people of quality and directness and integrity, the kind of people that a community needed and was lucky to have, the kind of people who had found each other in the specific way that luck and character combine to produce, not by accident but not by pure intention either, by the small, real, ordinary moment of a man who stopped when he could have ridden by, and a woman who let herself. After fury and after pride and after the long discipline of surviving alone, be grateful. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, everything. The summer evenings kept coming, and the porch kept receiving them at the end of the days, and the stars kept being enormous over the Colorado ridgeline, and the apple trees kept their counsel and their fruit, and the fence along the road stayed standing, a plain wooden line of posts and rails that looked like nothing in particular to anyone riding past on the road through Caldwell Creek. But it was the beginning of everything. It always had been.